Alright, so I'm going to write some equations here in sine and cosine. Right? So writing equations, sine and cosine. Alright, let's just make a quick table here, quick graph. Alright, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'll go up 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. Go one more. I'm going to leave the x-axis out for a second here. I'm going to change that around. So we're going to graph sine cosine. Let's just say we have a midline at 1. Okay, so I'm going to do a midline at 1. And from my midline, I'm going to start at my midline. So 0, 0. Or 0, comma 2. Sorry, midline at 2. All right, and then from here, I'm going to go up 2. So in 1, so if I move pi over 2, quarter way around the circle, I'm going to go up 2 units. And I'm going to move another quarter around the circle, I'm going to get back to my midline. Move another quarter around the circle, go down 2 from the midline, and then 2 pi around, get back to the midline. All right, so this is just me traveling around the circle. So if this is a table, 0, comma 2, pi over 2 going up to 4, pi going back to my midline, 3 pi over 2 going down to 0, and 2 pi going back to my midline, right? So 1, 2, 3 coordinates always go back to your midline. All right, and this will go on forever. So if I continue this, it'll go on again. And if I start here, I'll go back up, then back to the midline, then back below the midline, then back on the midline. And in the opposite direction, I'll do the same thing, right? So if I'm following this, so if I'm modeling this from here to here, right, the next thing it's going to do is go down. So if I do this, I'm going to come back down, then back up to the midline, back above the midline, back down to the midline, right? So it's always midline, above the midline, below, right? So that's pretty much, so on the midline, above, below, right? And it's going to keep following that pattern. All right. So this is your sine, cosine, right? It's going to be the same, pretty much the same thing. Okay, so when you're writing these equations, something that's not going to change in any of these, your max values, let me shoot this in. So if I look at this, right, there's my max, there's my min, and from here I'm going to get an amplitude of 2. Right, your midline is y equals 2. And for any equation you write, sine or cosine, y equals, your amplitude is going to always start your equation, and your midline is always going to end your equation. Right, so it goes up as high as 2 units above the midline, and 2 units below the midline, representing your amp. Where's your midline? Where's the center of your graph? That's your midline plus 2. All right, so let's look at this in the point of view of a sine curve. So sine. The number right after sine is your b value, which directly comes from your period. Okay, so if I consider a period here, my sine curve starts at 0, and it completes one cycle from 0 to 2 pi. So in this case, if I was looking at this, so if the period is equal to 2 pi, and we know from our formula that the period is equal to 2 pi over b, well in this case, 2 pi over 2 pi, and your b value is equal to 1. Now, regardless of these intervals that we're talking about, they're going to go, anytime you go around the circle, it's still 4 quarters around the circle. So I'm always going to break this up into quarters, right? So 1 quarter, 2 quarter, 3 quarter, 4 quarters, and that's going to complete your rotation, right? From some starting point. And in this case, I'm starting here, right? But let's make this one a little more challenging. Let's not use pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. Let's give ourselves anything else, okay? So I'm going to give myself different x intervals so I can see how the b value changes here. Let's say I move pi over 6 to the right. So starting at 0, I move 1 pi over 6, and then every increment after that is going to move by the same amount. So this will be 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6. And these can obviously be simplified, but I'm just going to keep going. But I think it's easier to see this way. All right, and then it goes backwards. Negative pi over 6, negative 2 pi over 6, negative 3 pi over 6, and I'll stop here at negative 4 pi over 6. All right, so my sine curve will go all the way through and keep going, or my cosine curve, however we write it, will go all the way on forever and forever. All right, so I'm going to get rid of this for a second. So in this case, my period is no longer 2 pi. So let me get rid of that. So my full sine curve is going to go from here to here, and it completes one full cycle, right? This is one cycle. And, sorry, this is one cycle here, and it completes the cycle in 4 pi over 6, right? By 4 pi over 6, there's one cycle. So my period is equal to 4 pi over 6, or if this is reduced, 2 pi over 3. So if my period is equal to 2 pi over 3, and the period is equal to 2 pi over b, so this becomes 2 pi over 3, which ultimately is just 2 pi over 1 times 3 over 2 pi, which is just 3. So now my b value is 3. All right, so I'm going to move this over. So now my b value is 3. So regardless of anything else, these 3 pieces of information, your amp, your midline, and your period, are not going to change. They're always going to stay the same. What could change is having positive amplitude versus a negative amplitude. What else is not going to change? Right, so I'm going to put that in there. And what else is going to change is potentially your phase shift, which is pretty much where you want to start. And you can start in multiple locations. Let's take the easiest one. Let's say I want to start here at 0. Well, if I start at 0, then my phase shift is 0. And the first thing I'm doing when I start drawing my graph, so one more time, the first thing I'm doing to connect dots as I start my graph is this piece right here. And the first thing I'm doing is going up in a positive direction. And if I'm going up in a positive direction, then my amplitude is going to be positive. Okay, so as I start drawing my graph, the first thing I did was go up in a positive direction, and I start the midline. So sine starts on the midline. Right? Always. And your sine of the amplitude is from that first point you chose, your direction. What's your first direction? Dictates the sine, positive and negative, of your sine function. Okay, so again, I'm starting here, So starting here, going up right away, completing one full cycle. All right, let's say I didn't want to start there. Let's say I could start, remember, as long as you start on the midline, so any one of these coordinates are on the midline. So you can theoretically start at any one of those. All right, so let's see what happens. I'm going to start left to right. So this is the first coordinate I see on my midline. So when I write my equation for this coordinate here, y equals, my amplitude doesn't change, sine of, your b value doesn't change, right? This part here is going to be my phase shift, abbreviate PS for phase shift, and my midline is not going to change. Right, so my three things that are not going to change, again, my amplitude, 2, my b value that came from my period, and my midline. Right, those will not change regardless of whatever, how I draw this graph, or how I write this graph, either sine or cosine. Okay, so my phase shift is where I start. Okay, so in this first problem, or in this example, I'm starting at negative 4 pi over 6, or negative 2 pi over 3. So in here, my phase shift, I'm going to put negative 2 pi over 3, which ultimately simplifies to plus 2 pi over 3. So that's my first equation starting at that point. Let's do another equation here. Let's say, again, 2 sine 3, open this up, x minus my phase shift plus 2. I'm going to erase this piece here. This. Okay, now let's say I move my starting point from here to here. All right, so I'm going to start here now. And I'm going to get my next equation. All right, so this point, I'm going to write that equation. All right, here we go. So my phase shift there is negative 2 pi over 6. So negative 2 pi over 6 or negative pi over 3 simplified. Okay, plus. They're always going to be sines because or sine functions here is because I'm starting on the midline. Right, so anytime you do that, it's always going to be the same thing. Now, I'm going to go back to this problem for a second. When I started here, at negative 2 pi over 3, the first thing I did was go up. Right? First thing I do when I'm drawing this function is I'm going up in a positive manner. Right? So because I'm going up positive, then my amplitude is going to be positive. When I start here at negative 2 pi over 6, the first thing I did, so I'm going to still draw my graph, but the first thing I'm doing here is I'm going down, which means my amplitude is going to be negative. So make sure that becomes negative here. So going down becomes negative. So you start on the midline, it's going to be sine. Choose a coordinate on the midline to start from. To complete your sine curve, if the first thing you're doing is going up, it's going to be a positive sign. If the first thing you're doing is going down, it's going to be a negative sign. And again, you can do this all the way. You can write an infinite amount of equations here that would all work. So here's one more. Y equals, let's say I chose 0 to start. Well, that would be my easiest one. So 2 sine 3 x minus and plus 2. In this case, this is x minus 0. So no big deal there. So this is just 2 sine 3x plus 2. And if I did start, let me get rid of this. If I did start at 0, 0, then the first thing I'm doing here is going, right, the first thing I did was go up. Right, and because I'm going up, and that's a positive sign, or positive 2 sign. And you can do that all the way through as often as you like. Right, I'll do one more. Y equals, let's say, take a second pause here. Let's say you use this value as a starting point, 2 pi over 6, or you simplify that, pi over 3. What would your equation look like? Right, if you want to pause and try that one out. So y equals, amplitude is going to be 2, doesn't change. Sine, b value doesn't change. X minus my phase shift, which I'll fill in, and plus 2. All right, so in this case, if I start here, then my phase shift is pi over 3, so minus pi over 3, and then I'm going to fill in whether I'm going down or up. So if I start here, first thing I'm doing is I'm going to go draw down, right? So I'm going down first, which means that my amplitude is negative amplitude. So going down first means a negative amplitude, so negative sign in the front. All right, so that's all your sine curves you could draw from here. So now let me clean this up a little bit. Now what I want to do is do a couple cosine curves. And it's going to be almost identical to what we did. All right, so we get this. All right. So cosine. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit, get this out of my way. All right. Y equals cosine, right? My b value, x minus, so this is going to be my b value, x minus my phase shift plus my midline, my amp. All right, so it's still the same graph. I'm still using the same coordinates. I'm still going to go all the way around. So my midline and my amplitude do not change. So 2 cosine plus 2. And the other thing that doesn't change is your period. Your period still doesn't change. And so my period is still 3. X minus my phase shift. So here, cosine or sine, your amplitude, your period, your b value, and your period, and your midline don't change. All right, so cosine is either going to start above or below the midline. So now here it goes. I'm going to choose any coordinate above or below. I'm going to go left to right. I'm going to choose this coordinate to start here. All right, so this coordinate is negative 3 pi over 6 or negative pi over 2. So my phase shift is going to be negative pi over 2. 2 negatives make a positive, and there's my first equation. Now for cosine, your sign here being positive or negative just depends on whether you start above or below the midline. So if you start above the midline, if your first coordinate's above the midline, it's positive. If the coordinate you chose starts below the midline, it's negative. So in this case, and pi over 2, negative pi over 2, that coordinate is above the midline, right? So we're above here, which means I'm positive. Let's choose another coordinate. Let's say I chose that. Let's say I chose this one, negative pi over 6. Right, so pink here, so I got y equals 2 cosine period x minus my phase shift plus 2. All right, so in this case, I'm using negative pi over 6 here. So minus pi over 6 is my phase shift. And the fact that it's below the midline, then my cosine is going to be negative. So simplified, negative 2 cosine 3 times x plus pi over 6 plus 2. And again, you could do this all the way through with any coordinate you choose above or below the midline. So recap, choose a coordinate on the midline, use the sine function. Choose a coordinate above the midline or below the midline, use the cosine function. If you're using sine, you're on the midline, first thing you do is go up, positive sign. Choose a coordinate on the midline, sine, first thing you do is go down, negative sign. Choose a coordinate above or below the midline, above the midline, positive cosine, below the midline, negative cosine. Hope that helps.